But I wanted to ask you the hot topic that everybody is talking about right now is Osama bin Laden. I'm not sure if you're aware, but on TikTok, there's a new trend where people are citing and saying that his letter about, the terrorist attacks on 9/11, that Osama bin Laden was the good guy. So tell us a little bit about Osama bin Laden in your opinion, Dinesh.
Well, I mean, what's interesting about this is I've actually studied that document. This is the letter to America, I believe 2002. And it's partly because I did a good bit of writing about America, about 9/11, about the motivation of the Islamic radicals. And at that time, Osama bin Laden was making certain points in that letter that kind of were never brought out, never discussed. It's almost like the letter went into hibernation for 20 years and has now sort of resurfaced in a completely different context. But the context in which the letter was written is bin Laden was basically making an argument where he was saying, everybody's saying that I'm killing civilians. And bin Laden basically goes, in a democratic society, there are no civilians because civilians are the ones who elect the government. So the policies of the government are a reflection of the beliefs of the civilians. Now, this is a very provocative idea, by the way, and not absurd on its face. It's something that we should have considered at the time, but it kind of went into dormancy. And I don't know how it's surfaced now in TikTok. In a weird way, it's more applicable to 9/11 than it is to the Hamas attacks. The Hamas attacks were manifestly civilian attacks. 9/11 was a little more complicated because, of course, civilians were in the planes, for example. Civilians were in the World Trade Center. But you can't argue that the Pentagon is not a military target. The White House is a military target. The World Trade Center, as part of the infrastructure of our society and capitalism, is in some sense a target. So, arguably, now, this is what I think bin Laden was going for, is that the civilians were just sort of the necessary mechanisms to launch this military type attack. Again, as I say, this is something that was worth considering way back when. It's now being used in a completely different and distorted context by morons on TikTok.
Well, and I agree with you that they're morons, but is there a way that they could be right in this sense that we funded the Mujahideen? In a way, they say that, Osama bin Laden was an asset. So at one point, wasn't Osama bin Laden on our side when we were fighting the Soviet Union? So was there a time when Osama bin Laden was, quote unquote, an ally of ours?
Well, this is complicated because this goes back to the Reagan era. In the Reagan era, the main framework was the Cold War. The Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan with 100,000 troops. And Reagan had a very sensible idea, which, by the way, we do well to consider today. The Reagan doctrine is a middle position between isolationism on the one hand and sort of, endless war on the other. Reagan's idea was, we're not sending troops. If people want to fight for their own freedom, they got to do it. But we are willing to help. And so, since there was a massive coalition of Muslims, by the way, from Afghanistan, from all over the Middle East, fighting against the Soviets, and arguably bin Laden was part of that wider group, I don't think looking back we were wrong to support the Muslims against the Soviets. Now, obviously, you can say later, well, in retrospect, there were some bad guys within that coalition. But look, politics is very often about the lesser evil. We allied with Stalin against Hitler. Why? Was Stalin a better guy than Hitler? Not exactly, but Hitler was a greater threat at the time. So I think that this is really how foreign policy works, or maybe in some cases doesn't work. And I think the mistake in Afghanistan was really not to support the Mujahideen, not to push the Soviets out. The real mistake was to commit to this absurd doctrine. I think it was Colin Powell who said something like, if you break it, you own it. What is this, like some store policy or something? And so we got the idiotic idea that if we chase the Taliban out of town, somehow we got to rebuild Afghanistan. We chase out Saddam Hussein, we got to rebuild Iraq. Nonsense.